Sometimes it only takes one unexpected moment to change the way we see the world. This is the story of a man, a quiet café, and a young woman whose strength couldn't be bought, only respected. But before we begin, tell us in the comments, where are you watching from today? We'd love to know. Now, let's begin. That morning, the city felt tired. A light drizzle was falling unhurriedly, as if the sky had been quietly weeping for hours, maybe days. Cars moved slowly, people hunched beneath black umbrellas that all looked the same. The grey asphalt, the fogged-up shop windows and the rushed, indifferent faces formed a scene that could only be described with one word: silence. It was in this setting that Julian Windsor walked into a small corner cafe. A discreet place with no flashy sign, tucked between a discount pharmacy and an almost bankrupt stationery store. The kind of place that, with his tailored suits and obscene bank account, Julian would never normally step into. But that day, something pulled him there. Julian was the kind of man who drew attention. Tall, impeccably dressed, confident stride, cold gaze. But inside that cafe, no one noticed. No one recognized him. No one cared. And strangely, he liked that. He chose a table in the back, against the wall. The seat was uncomfortable, the floor slightly sticky, and the ambient music came out distorted from an old speaker. None of it bothered him. He was there for another reason, though he didn't know what it was yet. In front of him lay a market report, printed on premium weight paper, lifeless. Filled with numbers, graphs, forecasts, the kind of thing that usually drove his days. But now, he stared at the pages without truly seeing them. The coffee in front of him cooled untouched. His expensive wristwatch ticked with Swiss precision, but for Julian, time felt suspended. It was as if, just for a moment, he had escaped the relentless pace of the world he helped build. Outside, the city moved on. People came and went. Most were ordinary faces, workers, students, regular people with regular lives. Meanwhile, Julian remained still, almost invisible. And for the first time in a long while, that made him feel human. He began noticing the details, the chipped countertop, the water stains on the wall, the crooked picture frame holding a faded motivational quote. Everything was imperfect, and maybe that was what drew him in. That's when she appeared, the waitress. Young, probably in her 20s, tired eyes but a steady presence. Her hair was pulled back hastily, apron worn thin. She approached with a coffee pot and in a calm voice asked if he wanted a refill. Julian nodded without much eye contact. She poured the coffee and moved on to another table. Just like that. No effort to impress, no forced friendliness. And that's when he noticed. She was different. She didn't treat him like someone important. Not like someone unimportant either. Just like a person. As simple as it seemed, that completely disarmed him. Julian found himself watching her from afar. The quick steps, the quiet efficiency, the way she handled customers. Always polite, but never submissive. Always present, but never seeking attention. It was as if she carried her own world on her shoulders and still managed to walk upright, head held high. He glanced at the report again. This time, with quiet disdain. He folded the pages carefully, slid them back into his leather case, and took a deep breath. It had been a long time since he breathed like that, for real. That rainy morning, in that modest cafe hidden between the city's rush, was becoming something he couldn't name. A pause. A break. A beginning. Julian had no idea who that waitress was. He didn't know her name, her story, or what she carried inside. But he knew, instinctively, that something in that space had reached him. And even without understanding why, he decided to come back the next day. Not for the coffee, not for the report, but for that strange feeling of presence. That rare moment when he, Julian Windsor, the man who could have everything, felt like he truly belonged to the world instead of just watching it pass by. Julian returned to the cafe the next day, and for the first time in a long while, he asked himself why he was going somewhere without it being about a meeting, a contract, or a social obligation. He just went. As if something inside him knew he needed to go back, even if his mind was still trying to rationalize why. It was early. The light rain still traced lines on the windows, and the sound of droplets on the awning played like a soft, almost comforting soundtrack. The cafe wasn't full yet. A few tired faces sat at tables, delivery bags on the floor, prep books open between sips of milky coffee. Julian chose the same table in the corner, the usual one, the one that gave him a clear view of the counter, but also enough shadow, enough anonymity. Lena was there. She came out of the kitchen carrying a tray, balancing 3 cups and a slice of cake. Her steps were quick but steady, her eyes alert, her hair tied back in a messy bun, a pen tucked behind one ear. The apron looked even more worn than before, with a small sauce stain on the side. But she didn't seem to care. Julian watched. Every detail like he was watching an old film, the kind where nothing explodes, no one screams, but everything moves with a quiet beauty. He noticed something strange in himself, curiosity, real curiosity. He wanted to understand who she was, what lay beneath that calm strength, what fueled that quiet dignity he hadn't seen in years. He placed his order, black coffee and buttered toast, simple, like her. When he finished eating, he folded the napkin neatly, placed his card in the bill, and as always pulled 2 large bills from his wallet. It wasn't just generosity. For Julian, it was a kind of silent code. A thank you in his own language, the one he'd used all his life. He set the money on the receipt and stood up to leave. But before he could take the first step, she appeared beside him. She saw the bills, and without hesitation, handed them back. "Sorry, but I can't accept this." Julian frowned, surprised. He'd been expecting a thank you, maybe a smile, but not that. "It's a tip," he said, as if reminding her of the rules. She smiled, but it wasn't shy or sarcastic. It was the kind of smile that carried a story. "I understand, and I appreciate it. Really, but I can't accept it." He stayed quiet for a few seconds. She wasn't being rude. It wasn't arrogance, it was firmness. A calm firmness that cut, deeper than any blunt rejection. "Are you sure?" he asked, still a bit incredulous. "It's just a gesture of thanks." She took a breath. Her eyes were calm, but very focused. "Look, real help can't be bought." That sentence, those 7 words, they entered Julian like a fine blade. She wasn't just refusing the money, she was refusing the system, the way the world worked, the way people like him tried to fix everything with folded bills. She didn't want that. She wanted something purer, something that couldn't be bought. Julian slowly returned the bills to his wallet. The gesture lost its meaning. The action lost its weight. For the first time in years, the money in his hand felt worthless. "I understand," he said, but he didn't fully. Not yet. She simply nodded, collected the empty plate, and returned to the counter, as if nothing had happened. But something had happened. Julian left the cafe, and the world around him felt quieter. Cars passed, horns honked, but everything seemed muffled, distant. Her sentence echoed in his mind like a stubborn refrain. Real help can't be bought. That refusal stirred something deep inside him, because he realized, maybe for the first time, that nearly everything he'd ever done was a trade, an investment, a gesture with an expectation of return, even the good ones. He'd never truly known what it meant to give without wanting anything back. And there she was, refusing the offer, refusing the game. He got home with that feeling clinging to him. took off his coat, loosened his tie, collapsed onto the sofa in his wide, cold living room, filled with luxury objects, and thought, why did that affect me so much? The truth was simple, because for the first time, someone looked at him, not at his last name, not at his fortune, not at his appearance, and said with complete serenity, I don't need you. And that absence of need felt like light in a dark place. That night, while the city slept and building lights flickered in the distance, Julian wasn't thinking about business or stocks or power. He was thinking about her, and for the first time in years, he was wondering how to be truly useful without being seen. In the days following that refusal, Julian returned to the cafe as someone returning to a place where something had been left unfinished. But it wasn't just curiosity, it was restlessness. That phrase, about how real help can't be bought, had lodged itself deep in a quiet place within his consciousness. He tried to continue his usual routine, but something had shifted. His attention, once consumed by spreadsheets, meetings, and screens filled with endlessly dancing numbers, was now drawn in another direction, toward the cafe waitress. That girl who, with just a few words and a simple gesture, had shaken convictions he had spent decades building. Julian began to observe her more closely. He sat at his usual table, but now without any pretense. He no longer pretended to read reports or used his phone as a shield. He was there to watch, and perhaps to understand. And the more he watched, the more he discovered. She arrived early, long before the rush began. She prepared the space in silence, wiped down tables with care, arranged the silverware with precision, even though no one would notice. There was a ritual in her movements, as if every small task were an act of dignity, a kind of daily resistance against the disorder of life. Julian noticed she was never still. She served customers, helped in the kitchen, made small notes in an old notebook, and during her short breaks, she retreated to the back of the cafe, a tiny space between stacked boxes and a makeshift cabinet. It was in one of those moments that he saw something that touched him in an unexpected way. She had her back turned, focused, holding a small blue piggy bank. Plastic, simple, childlike. The kind with half-faded cartoon stickers, one of them a superhero's face worn down by time. Gently, she shook the piggy bank near her ear, as if listening to the music of the coins inside. Then, she pulled a handful of coins and a few small, carefully folded bills from her pocket and placed them inside. She closed the lid firmly and hid the piggy bank beneath a cardboard box, like someone protecting something too valuable to be seen. Julian stood still, watching from a distance. And that's when it hit him. There was something much bigger going on than he had imagined. The next day, during a moment when the waitress stepped away briefly, Julian struck up a conversation with an older staff member, a man with white hair and a kind look in his eyes, who had served him once or twice with quiet warmth. Julian asked gently about the girl, about the piggy bank. He didn't expect answers, but what he received was even more valuable. Context. The blue piggy bank wasn't just a symbol of discipline, it was an act of restrained desperation. The man explained that she was saving money for her younger brother, just 8 years old, seriously ill with a heart condition. He was on a long waiting list for surgery at a public clinic, and every month he seemed weaker. With few options left, she had decided to try and pay for a private consultation, hoping it might speed up the treatment. She didn't ask for help, didn't accept donations, she just saved. A little each day. Julian listened in silence, hands in his pockets, eyes fixed on some point beyond focus. It was hard to process. While he negotiated multi-million-dollar investments in meetings, while companies fought for his attention with promises and dividends, there was a girl folding every coin to save her brother. A brother who might not even know the silent battle she was fighting for him. That night, Julian returned home later than usual. Not because of traffic, not because of meetings. He just didn't want to arrive, because his home, modern, luxurious, filled with glass and marble, now felt too big, too cold, and there, standing in front of the window, watching the city as he had done so many times before, he realized he had in his hands all the resources she needed. He could fix everything with a click, but that wasn't enough. She didn't want to be fixed. She wanted to be respected. She wanted to fight with her own hands, even if the coins were few, even if the path was unfair, and somehow that made Julian feel small, not in a negative way, but in a real way. Human, fragile, disconnected from what truly mattered. He spent the night thinking about how he could help, without her ever knowing, without humiliating her, without crossing that delicate line between kindness and vanity. For the first time in his life, Julian Windsor wanted to do something genuinely good, without expecting anything in return. Not a thank you, not a glance, not even the credit, just the quiet relief of knowing that, in silence, he had done the right thing. After discovering the reason behind the blue piggy bank, Julian spent the following days in quiet conflict. It was as if two versions of himself were fighting for space, the one used to solving everything with power and money, and the other, newly born, just beginning to understand the value of subtlety. For the first time, he wanted to help someone, and couldn't simply show up with a solution, not with her. Lena wasn't like the others. She didn't seek favors, didn't ask for anything, didn't leave room for pity. There was in that young woman a gentle rigidity, a strength forged in silence that made him think about all the things he'd never had to fight for, and that made him feel small and deeply admiring. Julian knew he had to do something, but it had to be invisible, subtle, respectful. And before making any move, he felt the need to understand more, to grasp why someone would choose the harder path when the shortcut was right there, so accessible, so tempting. One late afternoon, he found the opportunity. Business was slower at the café. The rain had paused and the city moved with a rare calmness. Julian stayed after lunch, pretending to scroll through his phone, waiting for her to take a break. And she did. She stepped out briefly to the back of the restaurant, holding a cup of coffee in her hands, her expression tired, but serene. He approached carefully, not wanting to intrude, just wanting to listen. He started with a light comment, almost meaningless. Something about the weather or how this cafe felt different from others. She responded kindly, but kept a slight distance, as if measuring the space between them. But Julian this time wasn't there as the man in the suit. He was just someone trying to understand. The conversation flowed slowly. Nothing invasive, just honest exchanges. And at some point, he mentioned, carefully, that he had heard about her brother's situation. That he'd overheard something, in passing, and that he thought it was admirable. That's when she changed. She didn't argue, didn't raise her voice, but her eyes hardened, her posture pulled back. And with a contained tone, she said she had already refused help before. It wasn't a warning, it was a reminder. She explained that once, when her brother was still a baby, a well-meaning neighbor offered to help with a box of groceries. Her mother, desperate, accepted. The gesture seemed pure. But in the following days came the comments, the veiled judgment, the sideways looks at condo meetings. The favor, which had seemed free, turned into a tool of humiliation. Later, years, on another episode, a coworker offered her some money when rent was overdue. Reluctantly, she accepted. The friendship ended 2 weeks later when he hinted she was too dependent. Since then, she had decided never to accept anything that wasn't the result of her own effort. Julian listened in silence. Each word was like a mirror. How many times had he himself used favors as a form of control? How many times had he helped while secretly expecting something in return, even if it was just the satisfaction of holding power? She didn't want that. She wanted peace and dignity. She wanted her brother to grow up seeing her as an example of strength, not as someone who was rescued by a stranger's pity. Julian realized, more clearly than ever, that any help he offered would have to be silent, invisible, and harder than any transaction he'd ever made, because it required more than money. It required humility. He thanked her for the conversation. He didn't try to convince her of anything. He just listened, respected her, and walked away with his heart full of something new. A mix of guilt, admiration, and, maybe for the first time, a sense of responsibility. That night, in front of the sweeping view from his luxury apartment, Julian Windsor made a decision. The help would come, but it wouldn't carry his name. It wouldn't be wrapped in vanity. It would be precise, real, and discreet. She wouldn't know. Her brother wouldn't. No one would know. And even so, or perhaps because of that, it would be the most important thing he'd ever done in his life. Julian spent the following days in silence. But it wasn't the usual kind of silence, the kind born from boredom or lack of words. It was an active silence, full of intention, careful planning, and thoughts that needed room to be shaped with precision. For the first time, he was about to do something truly important, and he couldn't afford to get it wrong. This wasn't about wiring money or paying for a surgery. He did that every day in 1,000 different ways. This was about protecting something sacred, the dignity of someone who had chosen to fight alone. He started slowly. He discreetly found out her full name, a forgotten receipt, a note on the counter, a background conversation. Then came her brother's name. Bit by bit, he searched public records, local clinics, until he managed to identify the public health unit where the boy was receiving care. All of it without alerting anyone, without leaving a trace. He didn't ask his assistants for help. No lawyers, no advisors. He made every phone call himself. He personally visited the clinic on a rainy day, wearing a simple coat, dark glasses, and a scruffy beard that hardly matched his public image. It was there that he confirmed the situation. The boy was on the waiting list. The surgery was delicate, and the wait could stretch for months. Julian returned home with a tight feeling in his chest. The image of the boy, pale, fragile, smiling despite his weak voice, was burned into his mind. And at that very moment, he knew he would do whatever it took to change that. But he would do it right. No noise, no spotlight. In the days that followed, he tracked down one of the country's top specialists, a renowned doctor with a respected private clinic, known for treating similar cases successfully. It wasn't easy to get on the schedule, but Julian knew how to move pieces without drawing attention. He booked the appointment under a third-party name, paid all the fees under the radar using carefully arranged transfers. Even the paperwork for the hospital transfer was handled through a small network of people who had no idea who they were truly working for. Once everything was in place, he wrote a letter, a simple sheet of paper, folded carefully, placed in a plain beige envelope with no markings. In the letter, he chose gentle words. He explained that there were people watching her effort, anonymous people, touched by how she devoted herself to her brother. That the help came not from pity but from respect. That there were no strings attached. That the consultation was already scheduled and every expense covered. He ended the note by asking her to accept it as a gift from the universe and to keep being exactly who she was. The letter was delivered discreetly, an envelope left at the cafe's front desk, addressed only with her first name. No signature, no logo, no clue of its origin. Julian didn't return to the cafe for the next 2 days. He didn't want to see her reaction, didn't want to risk ruining everything with a glance, a gesture, a word out of place. He knew he needed to give space. He knew he needed to disappear for a while, so that the gesture wouldn't become about him. When he finally returned 3 days later, she was there, just like always. She worked with the same focus, the same posture, the same swift steps between the tables. but there was something different in her eyes. A quiet glimmer, a subtle softness, like someone holding a beautiful secret close to the chest. She walked past Julian without saying a word. Just gave him a slight nod, the way she always did. But for a moment, their eyes met, and in that moment, something deeper passed between them. A silent recognition, not of identity, but of intention. She never knew for sure, never had proof, never asked, and he, true to his promise, never said a word. That night, Julian sat before the unlit fireplace in his apartment and felt something he hadn't felt in years. Lightness. For the first time in a long time, he had done something that didn't need to be justified, announced, or defended. Something that didn't make headlines. Something that didn't affect spreadsheets, or generate profit, or bring prestige. But it had changed someone's life. And maybe, just maybe, it had changed his too. Life went on. The cafe kept opening early. The rain kept falling steadily, washing over the asphalt, the sidewalks, the fogged-up windows. The same faces passed by, with the same daily rush. And Lena remained behind the counter, on the floor, moving between tables and cups. But something had changed. The blue piggy bank was still there, in the same hidden corner behind the boxes. It still received coins like part of a quiet ritual. But now, the gesture was lighter. The weight on Lena's shoulders seemed to have eased. Her eyes, once marked by urgency, now carried a kind of peace that didn't come from rest, but from hope. Julian noticed it from afar. He kept going to the cafe, always at the same time, always at the same table. He never changed anything. Never mentioned the letter. Never brought up the appointment, the surgery, or the steps that were unfolding in secret. He simply watched. And that was enough. Over time, he noticed other subtle changes. Small clues, almost invisible. Her apron had been replaced with a new one. Her hair came tied back more neatly, with a care that hadn't been there before. Her smile, once rare, now appeared more often, even if only for a few seconds. And one afternoon, he saw something he would never forget. Lena came out the back door of the cafe, holding a child's hand. It was him, her little brother, thin, pale-faced, but eyes full of life. The two of them sat on a bench out on the sidewalk for a few minutes. They shared a simple sandwich and laughed at something only they understood. She gently ran her fingers through his hair, and the boy leaned his head on her shoulder, as if he knew, even without understanding everything, that he was being cared for by someone who would never give up on him. Julian watched from a distance, and with a lump in his throat, he understood that that moment, so ordinary, so small, so mundane, was in truth a miracle. One of those miracles that makes no noise, that isn't accompanied by light or epic music, but that quietly changes everything around it. Because in that instant, she was at peace, and so was he. In the days that followed, Julian thought more about all of it. Not just about Lena or the boy or the help he had given, but about what it had awakened in him. It was as if, by helping someone without being seen, he had rediscovered a part of himself that had long been lost. The part that values the small things, the part that doesn't need applause, the part that understands not everything can be solved with money, and that sometimes the most valuable gesture is the one no one ever sees. He began to see the city differently. The same streets, the same buildings, the same cafes, but now there were stories behind every window, every corner. Entire lives unfolding in silence, invisible struggles, daily acts of bravery. People, like Lena, trying to keep their dignity alive even when everything around them felt like it was falling apart. And for the first time, Julian didn't feel above it or distant from it. He felt part of it. He realized he no longer needed to be the man who solves everything, who shines, who commands. He could simply be someone who observes, who learns, who offers what he can, even if it's just attention. One morning, as he was leaving the café, his eyes briefly met Lena's. She was behind the counter, organizing receipts for the day, when she looked up and saw him. For a moment, their eyes locked. And in that moment, without a single word, Julian knew. She knew. Maybe not the details, not the names, the pathways, the connections, but she knew. She knew that the help had come from someone who respected her boundaries, someone who asked for nothing in return, someone who understood that the quiet kind of love is often the only kind that truly matters. She didn't smile, but made the smallest gesture, almost imperceptible, of gratitude. Not with her face, but with her soul. And that was more than enough. Julian went home that day with his heart full. For the first time in many years, he didn't feel the anxiety that always haunted him. He wasn't thinking about the next deal, the next goal, the next problem. He was simply present. Later that afternoon, he opened a drawer and found a small envelope. It was the original draft of the letter he had written to Lena. The first version, with words he later chose not to use. He read it in silence and smiled, then gently tucked the paper back in the drawer and closed it. He didn't need it anymore. The silence left behind by the gesture had spoken louder than any speech ever could. It was that silence that had taught him more than books, more than mentors, more than decades of business success. Because in the end, it was that silence that mattered most. More than the money, more than the recognition, more than he ever could have imagined. Thank you so much for watching. If this story touched you in any way, don't forget to subscribe so you never miss the next one. And now, we'd love to hear from you. What did you think of this story? Leave your thoughts in the comments, and we'll see you in the next one.